For a long time, gaming felt like it was all about chasing power. More frames, higher resolution, better specs. And at some point, without really noticing it, that chase started to make gaming feel less fun. When the PlayStation 5 was coming out around 2020, it felt like the moment. 4K resolution, 60 frames per second. And after years of promises with previous console generations, this finally felt like the future of gaming. Technically, the PlayStation 5 delivered. But what it also did was reinforce this idea that gaming had become about numbers first and the experience second. Every conversation started sounding the same. Should I play this in performance mode or quality mode? Do I want smoother gameplay or better visuals? And instead of just playing, I found myself evaluating the experience before it even started. That constant comparison made it harder to relax. And what surprised me was how subtle that pressure was. It wasn't loud, it wasn't obvious, it was just this constant awareness that there was a better way to play. Even on a console where things are supposed to be simple, I'd sit there wondering if I made the right choice before I even started. And once that thought was in my head, it was hard to focus on the game itself. Now, I want to be clear, I'm not anti-technology. 60 frames per second with high visual fidelity is great. It really is. If someone offered it to me, I wouldn't turn it down. But at some point, it stopped being something that I appreciated and started being something that I felt I needed. And that is when gaming started to feel like work. I didn't dread playing games, I dread starting them. That moment where you sit down, controller in your hand, and instead of excitement, you feel hesitation. Not because the game is bad, but because your brain is already in evaluation mode. In 2023, I bought a Steam Deck. Originally, it was more of an investment for my YouTube channel, testing games, seeing how they ran, figuring out what settings worked best on that device. But instead of reinforcing that performance-first mindset, the Steam Deck accidentally did the opposite. The first thing I noticed wasn't performance. It was how little I cared about it. I wasn't staring at frame counters, I wasn't worrying about the modes, I was just playing. And it felt strange at first because I had got so used to gaming being something I analyzed. Playing games on a handheld changed how I approached them. A smaller screen, lower resolution compared to a TV, frame rates that were usually in the 30 to 40 range depending on the game, and somehow I cared less. Not because the games were worse, but because the experience was more focused. Now, there were real compromises: battery life, visual clarity, performance headroom. But those compromises forced me to ask a different question. Not, is this game running as well as it possibly can, but am I enjoying this right now? And what surprised me was that this feeling didn't disappear when I docked the Steam Deck to a bigger screen. Even on a TV, once I had dialed things in, the right settings, the right balance, and I turned the performance menus off, it still felt right. I could compare the specs all I wanted beforehand. I could tweak and fine-tune until things felt stable. But once the game started and the menus were gone and the numbers were out of sight, I was immersed again. The compromises faded into the background. When something has limits, you stop trying to make it something it isn't. And that's what changed everything for me. The Steam Deck wasn't trying to be the most powerful device I owned. It was trying to be the most approachable. And that shift completely changed how I felt when I picked it up. For the first time in a long time, the answer was yes. It reminded me how I used to play games. Back on the PlayStation 2, the GameCube, on a CRT television, or on handhelds like the Game Boy Advance, the Nintendo 3DS, or the PS Vita. Back then, there was no performance discourse. You didn't ask how a game ran, you asked if it was fun. And if it was, that was enough. I wasn't thinking about resolution, I wasn't thinking about frame rates. I was thinking about immersion and getting lost in the game itself. I didn't realize how much I missed that mindset until I found myself slipping back into it without trying. Now, I want to be honest, not every game is perfect on the Steam Deck. Even some of the verified games have issues. There's quirks, there's compromises, but what makes the difference is that I'm not tied to a single ecosystem anymore. I have access to a much wider library of games. And yes, that can introduce its own problem, choice paralysis, not knowing what to play, scrolling through menus forever and ever. But that's a different conversation and probably a different video. What the Steam Deck ultimately did was bring that feeling back. Picking up a game, playing it for 15 minutes or an hour, putting it down, and then coming back later without pressure. No guilt. Not feeling like I needed to justify how I was playing. And I think a lot of people would assume that caring less about specs meant caring less about games. But for me, it was the opposite. The less I obsessed over performance, the more connected I felt to what I was playing. At the end of the day, the Steam Deck didn't make games better. It made me stop chasing power. It reminded me that gaming doesn't need to push hardware to its limits all the time to be enjoyable. That fun doesn't scale with specs. We live in a time where gaming hardware is more powerful than it's ever been. And that's a good thing. But that doesn't mean that every experience needs to be maxed out. Sometimes enjoying games again means letting go of the chase, letting go of the comparison, and letting games just be games. If a handheld, whether it's the Steam Deck, the Nintendo Switch, or something similar, has changed the way that you view gaming or made you care a little bit less about frame rates and resolution, I would love to hear it. Thanks for watching.